Safe, reliable, free, and honest support. Qualities you cannot find online. Until now. Introducing the next generation of online technology support. What technology malfunctions are troubling you? Let us know today on the all-new support forums at www.theapplepost.com.
Welcome to GeekCross, the podcast where faith and culture intersect. I'm your host, Jeremy Yoder. In each episode, we look at a topic related to pop culture or geekdom and have conversations that use science fiction, fantasy, movies, gaming, or comic books as a jumping off point to talk about deeper issues and to wrestle with the big questions of life. I want to start off this particular episode by talking a little bit about what's going on. I've personally been experiencing a significant amount of upheaval. Now, I'm recording this on June the 29th, Monday night. Tomorrow morning, my family and I are driving from Colorado to Kansas City, Missouri for the biannual convention of the Mennonite Church USA. And we meet every 2 years to talk about the church, to hear reports, and to discuss issues that are affecting the church, as well as voting on resolutions. Now, this year is going to be really bumpy because we're looking at the possibility of a church split. And that's difficult. There's a lot of upheaval right now. The issue, of course, as is with a lot of denominations, has to do with the response to gays and lesbians and whether or not they can be part of the church, whether or not their relationships can be affirmed, or whether or not it's considered to be a sin. And this is a serious issue right now facing the Mennonite Church and a lot of other denominations. On top of all of that, my grandfather, Eli Bontrager, passed away on Sunday, and he was going to be 97 next month. So my family's attending this meeting in Kansas City, and after that meeting, we're going to be flying out to Delaware to attend the funeral of my grandfather. So there's a lot going on. Now, my esteemed producer, Zeph, has advised me, in general, that it's important for the podcast to be consistent in the days that we are being released, which has been a bit of a struggle for me to record these things. I'm going to be taking my mic on the road with me. I'm going to try to do some continued follow-up about some of these topics. But if I'm inconsistent regarding the podcast, I just ask for your patience. There's a lot going on, a lot of travel in the next week and a half. Now, I thought about a lot about what I would want to talk about, and I apologize to those of you who prefer me to talk about geeky things. But this is going to be a church-heavy episode because of this meeting that's coming up. And I've had some conversations with some folks who are not Mennonite, who are not even Christians, about whether or not I should talk about on the podcast about the dynamics of what we're facing in the Mennonite Church right now. And the response was just to go for it. My hope with that is by talking a little bit about what we're dealing with, that those of you who are not in church, those of you who do not have much to do with faith or with religion, can understand what is going on right now and the kinds of stakes that are involved and why this is difficult. So I'm going to be talking about this topic in a couple different short episodes. It's a lot of church politics. I don't want to go on too long about it. But in this episode, prior to the meeting in Kansas City, I wanted to talk a little bit about the context for what's going on here. As you all know, last Friday, the Supreme Court ruled that there is a constitutional right for same-sex marriage. And that's part of a longer discussion that's been going on for 50, 60 years, that has particularly in the last 10 years really taken off. And there has been this incredible shift in our culture where people are affirming and supportive of same-sex marriage. It's a huge shift. It's a huge reversal to where culture had been previously. This, of course, affects the churches in a lot of ways because for many Christians, marriage is not just simply a legal contract. It is a religious ordinance. I mean, I don't usually use the word ordinance, but I think to me that sounds like the appropriate word here. There's something theological about the meaning of marriage. Last Saturday, I attended a wedding for one of my wife's classmates. It was at a Baptist church in a town not too far from here. And what the pastor went on about, and what they talked about even in the wedding vows, is that the marriage between this man and woman was theologically symbolic of the marriage between Christ and the church. That it was some sort of symbol of that. It has some of that same kind of dynamic or essence to it. And I think that's part of the reason why Christians have long believed that marriage belonged to the church, not to the state. And so it's very upsetting to discover all of a sudden that the state has jurisdiction in some of that. Now, my point of view is that in our culture, in America, marriage has had sort of multiple meanings. One is it is a religious institution. It has religious meaning, but it's also a legal institution. It has sort of legal contract aspects to it. And that the Supreme Court and that the courts have jurisdiction in that legal aspect of it. But they can't change what the church feels or believes that marriage means. Now, in Western Europe, they have separated those two things. Everyone has to go first through a civil ceremony, a civil signing of a marriage license, and then has to have a separate religious ceremony with a pastor. If you belong to like a Lutheran or a Catholic church, a state church, the pastor is allowed to do this function. Both of those functions as we do here in the United States. But if you're not Lutheran or Catholic or part of the state church, you're not allowed as a pastor to perform that legal aspect to it. And I think doing that has kept this to be a lot cleaner. We have in the United States have mushed these things together. Now, in regards to the Mennonite Church, what has sort of set this off is that a year and a half ago, my conference, the Mountain States Mennonite Conference, made the decision to license Theda Good to be a pastor at First Mennonite Church in Denver. And what was the problem here is that Theda is in a committed same-sex relationship. And basically, this conflict has been brewing for a number of years, and now it's finally erupted. And for the more conservative side of the denomination, this is the final straw. And churches are leaving. They're threatening to leave. There is a new group that has been started called Ivana, which means Evangelical Anabaptist, which seeks to sort of maintain the church's position on marriage. And what it comes down to are two sort of documents. One is the 1995 Confession of Faith that the Mennonite Church uses, and the other one is the membership guidelines. And what the Confession of Faith says in Article 16 is that marriage is to be between a man and woman for life. And what the membership guidelines say, if pastors perform same-sex marriages, their credentials are to be reviewed by their conferences. So in some ways, it seems to be somewhat straightforward. It's a lot more complicated. Article 16 actually never really mentions same-sex marriage. It is primarily about divorce and remarriage, which historically has been banned by the Mennonites, but it's been some shift and there's been some exemptions made to that. And we no longer, the liberal Mennonites, practice a ban against divorce and remarriage. The more conservative and the Amish, the Old Order Mennonites, they certainly do. And they view divorce and remarriage as a form of continual adultery. What's really important to remember is this. The Mennonite Church USA, even though it has a confession of faith, even though it has membership guidelines, it doesn't have a strong hierarchy. We are very weak in terms of hierarchy. The denomination is made up of 21 area regional conferences. And each conference, according to our foundational documents, is the one that holds the credentials for pastors. They're the ones who make the licensing decisions, whether or not a person should be licensed or ordained to be a pastor. And so what has happened is that my conference, the Mountain States Mennonite Conference, made a decision because the leadership believed that they held the authority to license an individual, made a decision to license Theda. And what has happened is that other area conferences, other churches are angry and want the leadership of the denomination to step in and do something about it, to punish Mountain States Conference. And nothing has really happened. And part of the reasons why we have a weak hierarchy is that the Mennonite Church USA is actually not that old of a denomination. We're actually only about 10 years old, and we were merged between two other conferences, the General Conference of the Mennonite Church and what we call the Old Mennonite Church. Now, what's the difference between the two? A lot of it has to do originally with ethnicity. Now, the Mennonites come from a group called the Anabaptists, which was part of what we call the Radical Reformation. So when Martin Luther protested against the Catholic Church and put the 95 Thesis on the door of the church in Wittenberg, he was arguing about certain theological problems that he had with the Catholic Church. The main one, of course, being indulgences, where the Catholic Church was basically selling people get out of purgatory free cards. And while Luther led a kind of rebellion, a schism, a breakup from the Catholic Church, and a new form of Christianity emerged, Protestantism, he did not argue, he didn't disagree with the relationship between church and state. So that's what partly appealed to the German princes that became Lutheran. There was still a close marriage between church and state, but instead of relying on the Pope for church authority, now the princes had much closer control and were able to defy Rome. Didn't have to do what Rome told them to do. There were people in the Reformation who believed that reformers like Calvin or like Luther did not go far enough. And one of these groups were called the Anabaptists that emerged in Switzerland in the early 1520s. And they were a group of university students that looked at the scripture and believed that, in fact, there was a separation between church and state. That you could not be a genuine Christian if you were baptized as an infant because you had no choice in the matter. Now, the church was called to be a distinct community separate from the culture around them. And that's who the Anabaptists were. The reason why they're called Anabaptists is because they rebaptized. They baptized adults. And these Anabaptists experienced persecution from both the Catholics and the Protestants. They also were responsible for some misbehavior. The big story, of course, is the rebellion at Münster in northern Germany, where a group of Anabaptists took over this city and established a millennial polygamous commune, basically, waiting for God to return and bring judgment, and were eventually put down by the local authorities. Dan Carlin on the Hardcore History podcast has a very good and I think rather fair episode about these Anabaptists that did that. And for those of us who are Mennonites and who are descendant of the Anabaptists, the Munsterites have always been somewhat difficult. They're kind of like the embarrassing uncle or the embarrassing relative that you don't really want to talk about. But, you know, we kind of consider them to be sort of this dead end. They didn't go any further. What did happen is that some of the Anabaptists became Mennonites. And out of the Mennonites came the Amish. And so there are descendants, there are sort of theological and spiritual descendants to this rebellion against the authority of the state church. Now, the Mennonite Church, the Old Mennonite Church, that emerged in Pennsylvania and in Virginia and in Ohio and Indiana, that's related to the Amish, that's my background. Most of the ethnic Mennonites that came out of that group were originally from southern Germany and Switzerland. And they came to the United States in the 18th century. They were some of the first German immigrants in Pennsylvania. Now, the General Conference was established in the 19th century, and those are made up of Mennonites that came from northern Germany and from Holland. Many of them had immigrated, were invited by Catherine the Great to settle in Russia and the Ukraine and to farm. And so they had gone there, and many of them immigrated in the late 19th century to the United States because of persecution, particularly being forced to fight in the draft to go to the military, because Mennonites were pacifists. And they came and settled in Canada, and they settled in places like Kansas. And so they established what was called the General Conference. Now, the primary difference between Mennonite Church and General Conference in terms of polity is that the General Conference was a congregational in function. So there were certain things that said we all kind of agree on this, but ultimately congregations make their own decisions, theological decisions. They get to determine what they hold on to. The Old Mennonite Church, the Swiss German Mennonites, were very conference-based, that conferences made these decisions. There were bishops that were very powerful. And so these two groups basically went on and did their own thing for decades, until began this talk about merging the denominations. And that happened in sort of the mid to late 90s, and they were finalized in the early 2000s. Here was the issue. You now had two distinct church cultures that were now trying to be one denomination. One emphasized local discernment, congregational discernment. The other one emphasizes conference authority. That there are certain things that we sort of sign up for, that we all hold and believe in common, and if you don't believe that, you get disciplined. So here we have two opposing church cultures that are now in a denomination trying to be a denomination together. I think you can see where this is going and why this has ended up being kind of a disaster. The Confession of Faith, I believe, the 1995 Confession of Faith, in some ways is a political compromise document in that it says certain things. It has certain things in there that allowed both conferences to sign on, the General Conference and the Mennonite Church. From all I have heard about the original intent, none of the statements in the Confession of Faith were intended to be used for discipline. And yet, people came and sat in the room and thought that this is what we're getting. We're getting confession of faith that will be enforced, that says who is in and who is out. And so now all of a sudden we have this conflict where you have these conferences who are in the East, particularly in Pennsylvania and Virginia and Ohio, that have a very strong tradition of everyone agreeing and abiding by certain beliefs. And then you have conferences out west in Kansas and in Colorado that don't have that tradition, in which we feel that congregations make their own decision on these things, and that a confession of faith is not a binding legal document, but a statement of where the church is in general, a kind of an understanding of this is where we're at, but it's not necessarily written in stone. It's not the basis for church law or for dogma or anything like that. And so now we're caught in the midst of this conflict that has been rising up for the last 20 years, really, in the question of how to respond to same people who are gays and lesbians. And so I don't know what's going to happen this next week, honestly. I have no idea whether or not this denomination is going to be able to stay together. There's times I feel very frustrated and angry with those who are more conservative than I am, who I feel use power in ways that is not necessarily appropriate for the church. The threat of, if we don't get our way, we're going to leave, is to me sort of hardcore politics. Now, the more generous way of understanding this, and how they would describe this themselves, how conservatives would describe themselves, is the question of whether or not they can be part of a faith that is committed to something, and whether or not they have a place. I think there is enormous amounts of fear right now that as culture changes on this, that those who oppose same-sex marriage, those who believe that same-sex behavior is a sin, will be called bigots and will be silenced and will be marginalized. There's a great bit of fear of that, and they expect it to happen in a culture, but to happen in their own church, I think is incredibly painful for that. When Theta Good was licensed a year and a half ago, when that decision was made, my congregation experienced crisis. There were people who basically walked out of my church after 30 years of relationship and were just gone. They felt that they could not affiliate with us. They could not worship with us because of our affiliation with the conference. During that time, that was a very difficult time for me. And during that time, I didn't sleep for about a month and a half. And it was very, very difficult. So I think it's the single most difficult thing that I experienced, that I've ever gone through as a pastor. But I survived. And I think the blessing of people leaving, as hard and difficult as it was, is that they didn't stick around to cause more problems, more conflict. You know, in some ways it's better when somebody's unhappy to leave rather than to stick around and try to cause as much chaos as they can. Yet it's been difficult. And a year and a half after this decision, after people left, I still see a great deal of pain and anger in the congregation about those who left and about the decision that conference made, especially since they didn't ask my church for permission. It's hard to fellowship with other people. It's hard to worship with other people, it's hard to remain in relationship with those who you disagree with. I think, basically in terms of theology, that most Mennonites would agree on the majority of things. There are a couple that there's some disagreement about. And how do we respond to that? How do we handle that? I think there has been an attempt to find some sort of compromise in order to make it work, and it hasn't worked. It has often felt like that the denomination has attempted to push this down the road further and further, so we don't have to deal with it right now. And I think we've gotten to the moment now that there is one lesbian pastor in the Mennonite Church, and now especially that same-sex marriage is a constitutional right, that we can't kick this down the road anymore. Things have sort of come to a head. And I don't know what's going to happen next week. I think it's really easy for me to be scared and nervous and to panic because it's painful. I have people I care and I love about who are on both sides of this issue. And I don't believe that everyone who opposes, same-sex marriage or believes that being gay and lesbian is a sin is necessarily a bigot. There are some people who are very sort of theological reasons for that. And yet they're part of the church. Yet they are my fellow Christian. They are my neighbor. How do I love them when we disagree with each other? It is a question of how do you get along? And how do you remain affiliated? And how do you stand together, hang together when there is disagreement? I think it's a very human thing to want to be with people who are like you. I think it's a very human thing to want to affiliate with those who are you. We tend to be attracted to people who believe as we are. I'm not sure that's what the church is called to be. I don't believe in sort of a pure church. I don't believe in a church where we necessarily have all of our ducks in a row and we all agree with each other. The longer that I'm not in seminary, the less enchanted I am in having everything sort of correct theologically. I think life is much more difficult than that. I think relationships are much more difficult than that. It's not that I don't think theology is important. I do. There are things that I hold on deeply about that are part of who I am. And yet my hope also is that we find ways of relating with one another and being friends with one another and brothers and sisters with one another when we disagree. I think that's the only thing that really gets you through this. Mennonites have a long history of splitting apart and cutting fellowship and going their separate ways because we've often been concerned about the pure church, that we all have to agree. And I think there's part of that, I understand part of that, but part of that's also, I think, incredibly dysfunctional. My own family has been marked by some of this. My grandparents left the Amish in the 50s, my father's parents, and the family, my grandmother's family, excommunicated them. They shunned them. They banned them. They haven't talked to them in 50 years. That's incredibly painful, and that affects family deeply. And so I feel a certain amount of grief that my church family, people that I know and I care about, are wanting to get divorced, are wanting to split up, or rather go different ways. And that grieves me. At the same time, I do believe that next week, at the end of next week, there still will be a Mennonite church. And I would like to believe that there will still be hope and grace and life in there. That sometimes we don't see what is coming next when we're so deeply caught up with what is happening right now. And so I try to take the long view. Culture is changed so quickly and so deeply, not just simply on this issue of same-sex marriage, but on the issue of where church stands in culture, where the church is shifting from being at the center of culture to its edges, to its margins. And that's a very scary and frightening and painful transition for many people. And sometimes it's painful for me as well. And I tend to believe in a strong separation of church and state, but declining involvement in church, dropping attendance, dropping participation, has put a lot of congregations, including my own, in a very difficult place. We don't know how sustainable the church is anymore. We don't know how sustainable our structures are anymore. While I know there are some people that celebrate the end of the church, who believe that without religion, the world would be a much better place because we get blamed for everything, fairly and unfairly. I think it's much more difficult than that. I think religion has a role to play in our culture. I think there always will be some form of Christianity or some form of religion that will exist. It may not, however, be as institutional as it used to be. And so I see the fight over same-sex marriage as part of this transition that is happening. And transitions are not easy. They're a form of death. They're a form of change is death. And so we have to, in some ways, sort of dream new dreams because the old ones are not necessarily working. We have to find new ways of being faithful because the old church structures are collapsing. But yet I think there's still hope. At least I try to still have hope about the future. So to kind of give some context of what's going on, and I know there's probably lots of things that I haven't said or that could be explained better, and so I encourage you to tweet at me at JW Yoder, or you could tweet the show at GeekCross Show. You can reach out, and I'd be willing to have any kind of conversation to try to explain anything that doesn't quite make sense. I think this next week will be hard. I think there will be much goodness there as well. And I think sometimes, whether or not we experience something as a blessing or something as a hardship often depends on our own attitude and how we approach things and how we see things. So if you're praying, folk, I appreciate your prayers for the next week. If you are not praying, folk, I would appreciate good thoughts and good feelings and sending out something good into the universe. It's going to be okay, but I don't know what okay looks like, and sometimes that's very frightening. If you like GeekCross, you can please help us out and leave us a review on iTunes. You can find GeekCross on Facebook and Twitter. Twitter handle is @GeekCrossShow. Email is geekcrossshow@gmail.com. GeekCross is a McLaren production. Thanks for listening.